Okay, sorry about that. Got cut off with the max time limit um, per video. So here's the last section here on the critique and some of the cons. I was talking about the fact that she just had very little detail of her experiment interventions. There was no details on what types of peer activities were being done, what type of group activities were being done, what program she was using for the computer assisted instruction. And I thought just very, very um, nondescript. And I believe I mentioned this, but just no way to repeat this experiment on our own if we wanted to. Um, in applied research, obviously, we're not necessarily concerned, or I'm sorry, in action research, we're not necessarily concerned with generalizing results. But since this was both action and applied, and in applied research, we do want to generalize these results, that is really a major problem. And obviously, her intent to generalize the results is seen in her comments later on in the dissemination section at the end, where she's going to obviously share the results with the principal and then with other teachers if allowed to. But then her intention is to speak at the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics regional convention. Um, so obviously she's intending for her results for her school to be generalized for other teachers and even other teachers in other schools. And to have an experiment like this that really has so few details really would make that impossible to generalize. I mentioned this before, but there's also some bias in favor of constructivism. Um, One example on page 81, she's talking about the importance of these methods when she's talking about recommending the professional development for teachers. Um, so it's obvious that she's not just a neutral party seeing if this theory would work, but she really is more of a proponent, and you wonder how much, especially since we don't have a lot of the numbers she used to come to her conclusions, you wonder how valid those conclusions really are. Um, and you wonder if her bias in favor of this isn't skewing those results more favorably um, in the direction of promoting constructivism. And I would say, overall, I see a real, and I'll get to this in a moment, but I see a real over dependence on previous people's work to help prove her points rather than using her experiment to prove her points. But anyways, one other negative I saw was the fact that all the statements on her questionnaire were stated one way. And I know she did that so that she could use that 1 and 2 grouping and the 3 and then the 4 and 5 grouping to see whether students liked or were ambivalent or didn't like a certain aspect. But that obviously opens itself up to students just checking all one answer down the line and not being able to tell that because they're all stated the same way. And you wouldn't get any obvious contradictions if to be able to tell students we're just checking the same thing on all of them. There's very, very little statistical analysis done. I mentioned, we don't know the numbers. We don't know what their previous scores were, what their finishing scores were. She told us a little bit, but really, her intention is to generalize the results to a general student population, as I mentioned in her dissemination plans. But she really only uses descriptive statistics and seems to rely too much on the literature she reviewed as the quote-unquote proof of her study. Some sort of test should have been run to determine how much of a role the independent variables played in the improvement that was seen in the scores. And we even saw that earlier, that the problem with that would be the fact that we don't know if it really was her interventions or if it was just the fact that they were in that class to begin with that produced those results. And finally, this may seem like a little thing, but one thing I did notice throughout the dissertation was there were a lot of just grammar and those types of issues throughout the paper, and I've just pointed out a couple. But here, DeVries remarked that the difference between, she has a comma that she doesn't need, and even in the same sentence, the difference lie. It should be the differences lie, or the difference lies. Subject-verb agreement, just some basic things here. And then later on, her use of apostrophes when she's talking about students in a possessive sense. And here in one paragraph on page 15, she has what should both be students with the apostrophe at the end, because she's talking about a plural number of students, and it's possessive. But here she actually does it two different wrong ways in the same paragraph. And I believe, obviously everybody makes mistakes, but especially on something like a dissertation, it really speaks to credibility when you have a number of grammatical issues and things like that throughout it. So overall, I felt like this dissertation really had a lot of holes in it, a lot of sketchy applications, no statistical analysis other than just descriptive statistics, no implications of correlations that she was trying to draw between their performance and the independent variables, and while there were some good features in her study, just a lot of holes in what she wrote, in not giving us very much about her sample, not giving us much about what she actually did. And you can see this even in the table of contents. In the layout of the entire paper, the literature review took up, if I remember correctly, over 60 pages of an 84 or 83 page paper. And while that typically is a longer section of a dissertation, I felt like that, again, she was just depending on everybody else's work to prove her point for her, rather than really giving us exactly what was done and proving her own point. So overall, obviously I've never written one, but I would say a pretty mediocre dissertation on the whole. And while the ideas, I believe, are pretty good and pretty sound, I think that there could be some major improvements just by giving us more information.